Good morning to all judges, and today's session is about the neuro-ophthalmology. The first speaker of our is Dr. Mausami Banerjee. Dr. Mausami, are you there?
Yeah, hello, am I audible?
Yeah. Yeah, you can start now.
Okay. Just a second.
नहीं करूँगा, मेरा वहाँ का वो शो नहीं कर रहा
क्योंकि आपका सर अभी डिस्प्ले में दिया ही नहीं क्योंकि आपका लैपटॉप लगा ही नहीं
मैं अपने से कनेक्ट कर
Trying to
है।
Share your screen, Dr. Mosmi.
Is my screen visible right now?
No, not yet.
Is it visible?
Okay, now, yeah, it is visible. Yeah, you can start now.
A very good morning to everyone. I'll be discussing on my free paper to establish the relationship between the structural and functional parameters in idiopathic intracranial hypertension. So financial interest was noted in the context of the subject of the paper. So IIH is a condition characterized by elevated intracranial pressure and is a diagnosis of exclusion. So major morbidity of IH is visual impairment, which is usually reversible if treated timely. However, 40% of the cases may show permanent visual loss. Because of the increase in the prevalence of obesity, there has been an associated increase in IH, which necessitates the evidence-based diagnostic tools and treatment strategies. So the role of OCT is to differentiate papilledema from pseudopapilledema, monitoring of progression or resolution of papilledema, and determining the cause of loss of vision. Now, the aim of a study was to quantify the relationship comorbidity, that is the structural parameters with visual functional parameters in early and established cases of papilledema in IIH at baseline and at 6 months follow-up. Ethics committee approval was obtained. It was a longitudinal prospective study performed between December 2017 to February 2019. IH patients were recruited from the neuro-ophthalmology clinic and the neurology and ophthalmology OPD. Chronic papilledema cases were excluded. 27 patients who had undergone medical management and weight loss were included in the analysis. Patients who were diagnosed on basis of modified Dandy criteria, early and established papilledema, and age more than equals to 18 years were included. Whereas patients who didn't give consent voluntarily or had any evidence of hydrocephalus or any space-occupying lesion, pre-existing optic neuropathies, dense media opacification, and chronic and atrophic papilledema patients were excluded from the study. So the structural parameters were analyzed based on SDOCT. 3 scans were done: optic disc scan, which evaluated the RNFL thickness; the macular scan, which evaluated the GCL-IPL complex; and the 5-line raster scan, which evaluated the optic disc height. The functional parameters were the best corrected visual acuity, color vision, contrast, visual field charting, VR, and MFERG. All patients received oral acetazolamide in dosage accordance to the requirement. Patients were followed up at 6-weekly interval for 6 months. Appropriate statistical analysis was done with p-value less than equal to 0.05 considered significant. Coming to the results, 80% of the patients were female, whereas 20% were male. The mean age of the patients were 31 plus minus 7.3 years. Headache was the most common symptom present in 90.7% of the cases, with a mean duration of symptoms of 4.5 months. Other systemic comorbidities were PCOD, hypothyroidism, and weight gain within the past 1 year. The mean CSF pressure was 28.27 millimeter mercury, and partial empty cell and distension of the perioptic sheath was noted in 100% of the cases on MRI. 50% of the patient had transverse sinus stenosis on MRV. Now, a statistically significant decline in the thickness of the RNFL and optic disc height was noted over the 6 months. However, GCL had a statistically significant improvement in the thickness in the first 6 weeks, followed by no such statistically significant change. The functional parameters, all the functional parameters had a statistically significant improvement over the 6 months. Now, all the 3 structural parameters at baseline had a statistically significant correlation with the functional parameters at baseline. However, at 6 months, RNFL did not show a statistically significant correlation with any of the functional parameters. Now, in order to understand the role of structural parameters to predict the final visual outcome, a correlation between the two were obtained. And RNFL at baseline did not show any statistically significant correlation with any of the functional parameters at 6 months. Interestingly, the GCL-IPL thickness when the correlation between GCL-IPL thickness at 6 weeks and the final functional parameters was stronger than those that obtained at baseline. This is a graphical representation of the structural parameters at baseline with the final functional parameters. Now, coming to the discussion, all patients had increased optic disc height and RNFL thickness at presentation. Proprietary algorithms to measure GCL-IPL thickness in presence of significant optic nerve head swelling may result in erroneous appearance of GCL-IPL thinning in general, as well as in 20% of IH cases. In our patients also, there was an erroneous thinning of GCL-IPL at presentation with significant disc edema. The Iowa 3D segmentation protocol is a better protocol to measure RNFL and GCL-IPL thickness in such cases. However, it requires superior technical skill and is time consuming. In our patients, the baseline GCL-IPL and the optic disc height values showed a significant correlation with the final functional parameters. However, baseline RNFL thickness did not show any statistically significant correlation with the final functional parameters. And we also noted that GCL-IPL values at 6 weeks had a better and stronger correlation than that noted with the baseline values. So in order to conclude, it is important to identify the artifacts in the GCL-IPL measurements, particularly in presence of disc edema. In the setting of severe papilledema, RNFL can misguide the prognosis, and despite the limitation, GCL-IPL thickness can be a valuable tool for objective evaluation of the integrity of the optic nerve in patients with IH, and optic disc height may be used as an alternative or in combination with GCL-IPL in these cases. Thank you.
Can you explain me why did you get this discrepancy between the RNFL and the functional parameter, why GCIPL shows more correlation with functional parameter?
The previous studies, a lot of studies have shown that there is a correlation with RNFL thickness and with the functional parameters. But the important thing we wanted to emphasize here is when a patient comes from the neurology OPD, always they tell us to do the RNFL values. But we wanted to show that optic disc height and GCL-IPL had a better correlation than that with RNFL values.
What do you think? Can you explain me why did you get a better correlation with GCIPL rather than with RNFL? Is there any explanation for that?
Ma'am, the RNFL thickness had increased because of the exoplasmic flow stasis, which when resolved, then it's difficult to correlate the values with that of, because RNFL will be the first one to fall down when the I think the explanation given is because GCIPL, there is a thickness is much more, and the diameter of the cell body, the ganglion cell, is much more than the RNFL diameter. RNFL is very thin. So sometimes it's difficult to pick up the early changes in RNFL. You can pick up those changes in GCIPL, what is given in the literature. So that is one explanation they say. Okay.
Mausami, does why for IAS alone, can this apply for any papilledema for that matter?
Yes, sir, it might be, but we did the study only on IH patients. So I can't say about the other.
I think it should be, because papilledema is papilledema, the cause is different.
But the study was only...
pathology is the same in all the conditions, the cause is different.
Do you find the GCL-IPL changes in quadrantic way corresponding with the RFFN thickness? Any quadrantic GCL loss you have seen in your study?
So we noted a nasal and temporal quadrantic changes more than that of superior and the inferior, but it didn't correlate with the changes with the RNFL quadrantic changes as such.
Okay, one theoretical question is that GCL-IPL change, what is the normal ganglion cell cells there in the normal retinal layer, and what level when it comes down you see a GCL and IPL changes in these situations?
So in machines also there is a color coded already, there's a calibration, and usually we had compared with the controls also, so it's around 70 to 80 for the GCL IPL. 70 to 90 will be the average for the values of.
Okay.
I think we
I
should go
think
on.
we have. Yeah.
Next one, yeah.
Can you call upon the next person?
Thank you.
Dr. Deepankar, you can call upon the next presenter.
Next, yes, ma'am. Next presentation by Dr. Shivra Tagore, and he will be presenting ocular myasthenia study comparing sensitivity of repeated nerve stimulation versus bedside tests. Presenting author is a non-ratified member.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible. Okay, you can start.
Can I start, ma'am? Yes.
Yeah, you can.
Good morning, everyone, respected judges, dignitaries, and members of ARC committee. I would like to thank for letting me present my topic on ocular myasthenia study comparing sensitivity of laboratory test RNS acid, that is RNS and acetylcholine receptor antibodies versus the clinical test, that is forced eye closure test and ISPAC test. I would also like to thank my mentor, Dr. Priyam and Dr. Venkatesh sir, for allowing me to present my topic. Nil financial disclosure in my study. Introduction. Myasthenia gravis is an autoimmune disease characterized by antibody-mediated damage to acetylcholine muscle, resulting in impaired neuromuscular transmission, causing fatigability of the skeletal musculature. Ocular myasthenia is a subtype of myasthenia gravis where the weakness is clinically isolated to the extraocular muscles, the levator palmaris superioris, as well as the orbicularis oculi. Currently, there is no established gold standard test for diagnosis of ocular myasthenia. Currently, the current used laboratory tests include endorphonium test, which is widely available but lacks in sensitivity and specificity, SFEMG on orbicularis and frontalis, which has high sensitivity but has a lack of availability, acetylcholine receptor antibodies as well as RNS, which are found to have high specificity but lack in sensitivity, especially in diagnosing ocular myasthenia. Aim of my study was to compare the diagnostic efficacy of the clinical test and the laboratory test in patients with suspected ocular myasthenia. Role of acetylcholine receptor antibody test in predicting progression of ocular myasthenia to generalized myasthenia. The methodology was a prospective study on 68 patients. The patient with suspected ocular myasthenia underwent routine clinical evaluation with FECT and IPT test. Following probable clinical diagnosis, laboratory tests like RNA and acetylcholine receptor antibodies were done. Other tests like TFT, blood glucose, and CT scan were done to rule out other differential diagnoses. The results of FECT and IPT were not used to establish the final diagnosis. So the final diagnosis was established if at least one of the standard diagnoses was positive in absence of other causes, which included presence of acetylcholine receptor antibodies, decremental response of 10% of the third to fifth compound muscle action potential with respect to first after RNS, positive intramuscular neostigmine test. Patient with negative diagnostic result was still considered as ocular myasthenia if they demonstrated unequivocal response to oral steroid and cholinesterase inhibitors for a period of at least 3 months. Results of my study, it was found that the mean age in this population was 48 years, with male being more commonly affected. Acetylcholine receptor antibodies were found positive in 25% of patients, and 13 patients progressed to generalized myasthenia. The sensitivity of forced eye closure was found to be 96.7%, with specificity being 75 and positive predictive value with 96.7%, which was found to be comparatively higher than RNS test. The combined FECT and IPT test with at least one positive was found to be the highest sensitivity, which was comparable to that of combined FECT and RNS test. Although the combined FECT and IPT test with both positive had less sensitivity, it was found that the specificity as well as the positive predictive value was 100%. This was especially useful in patients with suspected ocular myasthenia, which had double negative RNS and acetylcholine receptor bodies. We can still diagnose it to be a myasthenia on the basis of these findings of this study, in which FECT sensitivity and specificity was found to be 100% and 80%. The ISPAC sensitivity and specificity was found to be 70% and 40%. And the combined FECT and IPT with both of them positive in patients who were negative for both RNS and acetylcholine receptor antibody was found to be 100% with a positive predictive value as well as negative predictive value of 100% in our study. The acetylcholine receptor test were positive in 25% patient, 13 out of which progressed to generalized myasthenia, out of which acetylcholine receptor antibody was positive in 11 patients, and the patients were followed up to 36 months. Patients who developed generalized myasthenia were more likely to have acetylcholine receptor antibody test according to our result. Coming on to discussion, it was found that FECT had the highest diagnostic yield compared to IPT, RNS, and acetylcholine receptor antibody test. 15 patients in our study were double negative for RNS and antibodies. The positive value of combined FECT and IPT with both of them positive are 100%. Also, the negative predictive value of both of at least one was 100%, indicating that diagnosis of ocular arrest is very unlikely if both of these tests are negative. Antibody positivity in our study was 41%, had showed a 41% sensitivity, which falls in the lower limit of previous study, which estimates it to be 40 to 70%. This could be because that studies have shown that certain level of receptor binding saturation, this antibody start to be visible in the peripheral blood. As many of our patients were seen in the early disease, they might not have adequate level of circulating antibodies for detection. Also, the rate of progression of myasthenia was found to be 19%, contrary to the existing studies, which shows 50 to 80% of the myasthenia was generalized to generalized myasthenia. But it might be due to the fact that the early initiation of corticosteroid and paroxysmal in our study, which can also show that if we start steroids early in our study, there is less likely of progression of ocular myasthenia to generalized myasthenia. These are my references. Thank you.
I think rather than using RNFL, if you would have chosen single fiber EMG, then the results might be different. I think so, because that is much more sensitive electrophysiological test.
Yes, ma'am, but the only drawback was that test was not available in our institute. So
Okay, yeah.
we chose to go to detect on acetylcholine receptor antibody was an RNS test as more of a diagnostic.
Good study, nice.
And the thing is, probably, if you think of ocular myasthenias may be true, but if we are considering myasthenia otherwise, the problem is probably RNS will be more sensitive. Since as far as the eye is concerned, probably these two simple tests tell us a lot, so that the repetitive nerve stimulation may not be necessary, and maybe this will give us better results. But for myasthenia otherwise, probably this may not hold true, that RNS repetitive nerve stimulation may be the confirmatory test otherwise.
Among the, hello?
Oh, sorry, sir. Okay. Please go ahead.
Hello? Among the 19% general myasthenia, how many people went for difficulty in swallowing and respiratory distress?
Sir, no as such respiratory complaints were found, but limb involvement was found in this patient.
Difficulty in
the
deglutition.
upper and lower. Bulbar involvement and sorry.
Deglutition distress.
No, sir. Deglutition was not observed in our studies.
Okay.
Was there any case of?
Sorry, sir. Sir, I did not hear you, sir. Sorry, sir.
I think his connection went off. Okay.
Hello.
We can go to the next presenter.
Next
We can
speaker.
call upon the next presenter, Dr. Lobo.
Yes, ma'am. We can call the next speaker.
Yeah, you call the next speaker.
Dr. Anit Varghese, you're there?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, please start.
Yes, ma'am. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Anit, and my paper is on diagnostic field of neuroimaging in endonuclear ophthalmoplegia. We have no financial disclosure or conflict of interest with the presented material in this presentation. Endonuclear ophthalmoplegia is a localized neuroophthalmic disorder caused by disruption of the medial longitudinal fasciculus. The abducent nucleus contains motor neurons which innervate the ipsilateral lateral rectus and interneurons which innervate the contralateral medial rectus via the MLF. The right frontal eye field initiates the left lateral gaze. Impulses from the right PPRF are transmitted to the sixth nerve and via the sixth nucleus and via the sixth nerve to the left lateral rectus, initiating abduction in left eye. Simultaneous impulses pass via the MLF to the right oculomotor nucleus and via the right medial oculomotor nerve to the right medial rectus, initiating adduction in right eye. Thus, a conjugate eye movement to the left side is achieved. Any disruption or lesion involving the MLF will cause internuclear ophthalmoplegia. The cardinal features of INO include adduction restriction in one eye and abducting nystagmus in contralateral eye. In cases of bilateral INO, there can be bilateral adduction restriction, slow abducting saccades, and designated rescue. This is a clinical picture of a patient who presented to us with right-sided INO. As we can see, there is adduction restriction in right eye, whereas all other movements are full. This is a clinical video of a patient who presented to us with left-sided INO. We can see there is adduction restriction in left eye and abducting nystagmus in right eye. This is MRI of the same patient. We can see acute infarct involving the midbrain. Moving on to the causes of INO, causes can be ischemic, which are usually seen in elderly patients and are usually unilateral. Demyelinating conditions like multiple sclerosis are usually seen in young patients and are usually bilateral. Infections and inflammatory conditions and unusual causes like trauma, tentorial herniation, neoplastic conditions, and vasculitis can also cause INO. Aim of our study was to assess the etiology of INO with the help of neuroimaging. This is a retrospective observational study done in our neuro-ophthalmology department. The medical records of 31 patients presented with INO in our tertiary care center in the past 2 years were studied. From their records, clinical features, findings of complete neuro-ophthalmic examination, neuroimaging, treatment and outcomes in terms of improvement in extraocular movements and visual acuity were noted. Specific emphasis was laid on documenting the findings of neuroimaging, that is MRI. Neuroimaging was done in all patients and the results were interpreted by an eminent neuroradiologist. Moving on to our results, out of the 31 patients, 13 were males and 18 were females. Age ranged from 20 to 75 years with a mean age of 54 plus or minus 14 years. 13 of them showed left-sided INO, 11 of them had right-sided INO, and 7 patients presented with bilateral INO. Skew deviation was seen in 4 cases. Double vision was the most common symptom seen in 84% cases, and other symptoms include eye pain, defective vision, and deviation or squinting of eye, noted by the patient or attendant. Moving on to the MRI findings, about 10 patients had MRI was within normal limits in 10 patients. Generalized small vessel ischemic changes were seen in 8 patients. Acute infarct involving brainstem or cerebellum as a cause of INO was seen in 11 cases. A pontine lesion, a lesion involving posterior pons was seen in 1 patient, and a case of dengue encephalopathy was also seen. Out of the 7 bilateral cases, acute infarct as a cause of INO was seen in 3 cases. MRI was within normal limits in 3 cases, and a case of dengue encephalopathy causing bilateral INO was also seen. 97% patients improved clinically with conservative management alone, and 1 patient underwent surgical intervention. Moving on to discussion. In a 33-year period study done by K&J et al., the most common cause of INO was found to be infection, followed by multiple sclerosis and unusual causes. In contrast, our study revealed a different pattern. Acute infarct as a cause of INO was seen only in 11 cases. MRI was within normal limits in 10 cases, and generalized small vessel ischemic changes were seen in 8 cases. Whereas specific lesions involving midbrain or brainstem were not seen in these cases, and these cases are also categorized as normal. Therefore, a total of 58.2% cases were categorized as MRI normal. In a similar study done by Eggenberg et al. States that about half of their patients with presumed brainstem ischemia underlying their INO do not have any demonstrable lesion or MRI. They also stated that MRI had limited lead in demonstrating the causative infarct. INO is one of the most frequent oculomotor disturbance in patients with MS. In our study, we couldn't find any lesions suggestive of MS on MRI. In a study done by Kim J. et al. Stated that for demyelinating lesions, proton density imaging may be superior to T2 retinal flare sequences. INO is an uncommon complication of closed head trauma. Bilateral INO resulting from head trauma is more commonly reported than unilateral INO. Unilateral INO without any associated neurological deficit is a very rare complication of blunt head trauma. We had a patient who presented to us with unilateral INO following road traffic accident. His MRI and CT didn't reveal any significant abnormality, and the patient improved clinically over a period of 6 months with conservative management alone. INO due to infectious etiologies like TB, AIDS, brucellosis, cysticercosis, and syphilis is very known. Clinical presentation of INO associated with dengue encephalopathy is very rare. We had a 28-year-old male patient with a history of dengue fever presented to us with bilateral INO. His MRI showed hemorrhages involving inferior pons, bilateral cerebral hemispheres, bilateral frontal lobes, and thalamus, suggestive of dengue encephalopathy. The patient later underwent modified Nishita's procedure in both time for persistent screen. Conclusion: a complete neuro-ophthalmic evaluation can clinically diagnose a case of INO. In our study, the diagnostic neuroimaging yield was only 41%, ischemia being the commonest etiology. I would like to thank Dr. Padmavati Madam for guiding me and giving me this opportunity. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Dr. Ani, can you tell us how do you, on MRI, can you differentiate between a vascular and findings due to, the INO due to vascular causes versus demyelination?
Yes, madam. In demyelination, we can see, as we have shown one video of one patient, we can see acute infarct involving the brainstem. And cases of demyelination, especially in MS, we can see that periventricular lesions suggestive of MS, ma'am.
Okay, but localizing it to the INO, to the pons and the midbrain, will there be a difference between the two? Now, you are only talking about changes elsewhere.
Ah, yes.
Periventricular. So there may be an institutional bias because normally in a young person, and your patients also are more females.
Yes.
MS is more likely to occur than other causes. So maybe there's an institutional bias.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's a good study, something which has not been addressed.
Yes, thank you.
Can you tell me, Dr. Anit Varghese, in dengue, was it found in acute stage of dengue or?
No, sir. Patient presented to us 7 or 8 months later with complaints of double vision and squinting. Sir, patient gave history of dengue fever 6 or 7 months back. He had history of altered sensorium and aphasia and other neurological deficit. He was admitted in a neurological center as a case of dengue encephalopathy. Sir, his dengue IgM was positive. Serum dengue IgM and CSF was also suggestive. Examination was also suggestive of dengue. And he was negative for all other like Leptospira, Japanese encephalitis, and all other bacterial viral diseases.
How long?
Sir?
How long it take to recover from INO in dengue case?
Sir, later after 1 year, we did a modified Nishida's procedure in both eyes for this patient. Right eye showed more deviation compared to left eye. So first we did in surgery in right eye and then in left eye. But still now a patient is having mild like 15 to 20 degree exotropia. Still he is having.
Okay, thank you. Good study.
Dr. Varghese, these dengue cases, do you have optic neuropathy or retinopathy in this case? Just extended to Sar's question. This case of dengue presentation,
yes, sir. We usually have,
does it have optic nerve involvement or a retinopathy, dengue retinopathy?
Sir, I couldn't understand your question, sir. Can you repeat it once
This
more?
patient with dengue INO, was there optic neuropathy or say retinopathy associated?
No, sir, no. His vision was less than initially when he presented, but later he improved, sir. There was no retinopathy.
One of your patients.
I think we can go on to the next speaker. Thank you, Dr. Anit.
Thank you.
Dr. Ankita is there. Dr. Ankita Goyal.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Ankita Goyal, you may start.
Yes, sir. So, there's some technical glitch over here.
Are you able to resolve it? Or we can call upon the another one and then you can just take on presentation later on.
So I'm just starting it.
Okay.
Sir, is my screen visible?
Yeah.
Visible.
Yes, go on.
Yes, ma'am.
Make it full screen and go on.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Ankita Goyal, and the title of my pre-paper presentation is Prediction of Visual Acuity in Patients of Acute Optic Neuritis in relation to the segment of lesion. No financial interests are involved. We all know optic neuritis is an acute inflammatory condition of the optic nerve closely associated with the incidence of multiple sclerosis. Even if the visual acuity returns to 6/6, there are mild deficits in the other visual parameters too. Contrast enhanced MRI is a routine evaluation nowadays done, and it has very vital role as well. Few authors in their research work have observed that initial length and location of the lesion is associated with the degree of visual loss and might predict the visual outcomes too. So here comes the aim of the study, that is to study the relation of visual acuity with the segment of lesion on gadolinium enhanced contrast MRI in patients of acute optic neuritis. The study was conducted in central India for 2019 up to February 2020. And the inclusion criteria was all patients who were presenting with acute optic neuritis and willing to go for the contrast enhanced MRI. Any patient who was having a previous episode of acute optic neuritis and vision did not return 6/6, that was excluded, and non-arthritic cases were also excluded. The corticosteroid treatment, if it has been taken previously, then again the patient was not taken into the study. Comprehensive and the standardized ophthalmic examination was done. The visual acuity was noted down with the help of Snell's chart. And after that, the patients went for the contrast enhanced MRI. Visual acuity of more than 0.2 was considered good. The patients were followed up at 4 weeks interval and up to 12 weeks. So there were 3 consecutive follow-ups. The results that came out was total of 30 patients were taken into the study. More of female were there as compared to the males, that is 22 to 8. And the mean age of presentation was 37.63. The mean duration of complaints with which the patient came was around 10 days. And 2 patients were lost to follow up at around 8 weeks. So the MRI findings that we found here were that 30 eyes, that is 93.75% of the eyes, they all had a normal enhancement of the optic nerve. 2 cases were there that had bilateral optic neuritis, and based on the segments, intraorbital segment was the most common segment involved. We got 2 segments in each involvement, that is intraocular with intraorbital and intraorbital with canalicular. There was no singular segment involved here. And this is an MRI picture of a patient that was having bilateral optic neuritis, specifically in the canalicular. Some part of the intraorbital optic nerve was also involved. The visual acuity at baseline and follow-up, the presentation at presentation, the mean baseline visual acuity was recorded to be 0.97, and none of the MRI subcategories differed from each other significantly. When the subjects were followed up at 4 weeks, mean visual acuity was found to be 4.4. It was improved actually, and around 33% with intraocular involvement, only 6% with canalicular involvement had good visual acuity at first follow-up. On subsequent, that is second and third follow-up, we found that there was a similar significant difference between the 2. That is, the canalicular portion did not, patients with canalicular portion did not improve much as compared to those that were having intraocular segment involvement. The mean visual acuity of the subjects at 12 weeks was with intraocular segment involvement was recorded to be 0.0. That was around 6/6, and with canalicular segment was still 0.6. Highest percentage of subjects that improved to good vision had intraorbital enhancement, but no significant association between the visual acuity could be derived. These are the mean visual acuities which were jotted down during at the baseline, at first follow-up, at second follow-up, and at third follow-up. We can see here that the improvement in cases of intraocular segments were much more, and intraorbital segments too improved, but those which were having canalicular and the intracranial portion involvement did not improve much. This is a table which shows the improvement, that is subjects in each group that were having improvement of more than 0.2 or less than 0.2, and it was found to be significantly better association of vision in patients with intraocular segment involvement as compared to those which are having the canalicular portion involvement. The discussion in our subjects, all the studies clinically diagnosed as cases of acute optic neuritis, the optic nerve enhancement of the affected portion was observed 93.75%, which was similar to that found by Cooper-Smith et al. And Hickman et al. The optic nerve was studied for segment enhancement, and intraocular with the intraorbital was the most common segment involved. Then at baseline, no significant association could be found between the segment of enhancement and the visual acuity, and the subjects with the canalicular segment did not improve much over 12-week course. In a study conducted by Dunker et al., intracanalicular lesions of optic nerve recovered incompletely or partially. This was a similar finding that we found in our study too. And however, there were a lot of limitations too, because the sample size was small, so the results could not be that generalized, and follow-up duration was 3 months. And since we lost 2 patients, so the results can vary according to that also. So we need more studies for that. These are the references. Thank you.
Dr. Ankita,
Yes, sir.
how do you differentiate because you were doing CEMRI, contrast enhancement?
Yes, sir. Contrast enhanced MRI.
How you differentiated intraocular and intraorbital segment involvement?
Sir, intraorbital and intraocular was basically on the clinical examination more. If there was optic nerve head involvement, then on fundus it was very well appreciated with the blurring of the margins of the optic nerve head and mild hyperemia.
No, you might be seeing the papillitis.
Yes, sir, papillitis. Yes, sir.
And then there was intraorbital enhancement on CMRI.
Yes, sir.
And then you considered it as intraocular plus intraorbital.
Yes,
I think
sir.
I'm getting it right.
Yes, sir.
Because on contrast enhancement, you cannot differentiate intraocular and
Intraocular portion, yes, sir. It's not.
Yeah. Explanation, did you look at the cause for the optic neuritis? I mean, were there any atypical? Because I noticed that some patients presented after 20 days.
Yes, ma'am.
And ideally, typical optic neuritis starts improving in 2 weeks.
Yes,
so
ma'am.
obviously you had some atypical ones. They are unlikely to improve as well as a typical optic neuritis. That's one.
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
and even the cause, if you have optic neuritis secondary to MS or idiopathic versus the other, MOG and aquaporin antibodies positive, those are less likely to improve. And
Yes,
as
ma'am.
you rightly said that your duration was too short because, if it was a little longer, maybe everyone would have sort of more or less had the same outcome. Can't say, it could be
Yes, ma'am.
a little more useful. But anyway, it's a good thought that you had.
Thank you, ma'am.
Any bilateral, sorry, please go ahead.
Doctor, I would like to ask one question. Your study period was during this COVID. All the patients were tested for COVID or not?
Sir, the study actually started in 2019.
Okay.
February. So at that time, we got lots of patients of optic neuritis, especially in the rainy season too. So we were able to follow up them. But yes, after 2020 January, as soon as January started, we definitely didn't go forward with the study much. The patients were not coming.
My question was, if you had
Yes, sir.
some patients with COVID,
Yes, sir.
positive, can there be any difference in outcome or presentation?
Presentations are definitely in COVID patients. We get more of the occlusion patients. These could be the artery occlusion patients, or they that is with presenting with retinitis too. And here the patients that is during the COVID era, yes, we have to get it tested for COVID too. But the association of neuritis, optic neuritis with COVID has not been that established till now. So more of the patients of CRAO we were able to found.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Any bilateral cases or pediatric optic neuropathy in your series?
Sir, bilateral cases, 2 pediatric bilateral cases were there. We went for the CSF examination, but yes, we were the patients, and also we do not have the aquaporin testing facilities at our institute. So we could not find out the etiology for that. So that was a problem. Otherwise, we followed the children up, but yes, improvement was not good in those times.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Jay Gopal Agarwal is there. Dr. Jay Gopal Agarwal. The next speaker, Dr. Jay Gopal Agarwal, is there or not?
Who is the next speaker, and then we'll see if Dr. Jay joins us.
Dr. Jayagopal, are you there? Or should we go to the next one?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, the next one is Dr. Arup. Dr. Arup.
Madam,
Dr. Arup, are you there?
the presenting author is Parmita, madam.
Parmita Datta.
Parmita Datta. She is the presenting author.
Okay, sorry.
Arup is the co-author.
Okay, Dr. Parmita, are you there? Dr. Jayagopal or Dr. Parmita?
Madam, Dr. Parmita also not logged in.
Okay, then we go to the third one. Dr. Jasmine?
Jesslyn Johnson.
Madam is available.
Dr.
Yes.
Jasmine?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. You can go ahead with your presentation.
Okay, okay, ma'am. Hello, ma'am. Hello.
Yeah,
You're audible.
Hello.
Yes, Dr.
you are
Jay.
audible.
Yes, you are audible and your screen is coming. Open your presentation and go ahead.
Is my screen visible, ma'am?
Yeah, your
Yes, your screen. Make it full screen and go.
Slides. Hello, ma'am. Can you see my screen?
Now you can start.
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Today I will be presenting lactation optic neuritis, a case series. I have no financial disclosure. As we all know, optic neuritis, it is an inflammatory condition of the optic nerve that presents with sudden onset painful loss of vision, mostly in young females, and idiopathic and demyelinating disorders are the common causes. Lactation optic neuritis, it is the optic neuritis that occurs postpartum during lactation, and previously it was considered as a clinical entity of its own. Usually it occurs through 3 months postpartum with high chance of recurrence during the same period, and the course is similar to classic optic neuritis. Here we present a retrospective case series of 3 postpartum lactating women during a period of 6 months, and the mean age was 24 years. All the cases presented to us with painful defective vision in one eye, none had any neurological symptoms or signs. First 2 cases had uneventful past medical and obstetric history, and the third case developed an episode of optic neuritis during the antenatal period at 28 weeks during the same pregnancy. She was treated as per ONTT protocol and she recovered completely by 2 weeks. Coming to the case scenarios, first case was a 24 years old lady at 3 months postpartum presented with left-sided defective vision and for a duration of 10 days. And the best corrected visual acuity was 6/12, color vision was defective and contrast sensitivity was reduced. Pupil showed grade 2 RAPD and visual field showed paracentral scotoma. Case 2, it is a 26 years old lady presented at 3 months postpartum with right eye defective vision of 10 days and visual acuity was 5/60. Pupil showed grade 4 RAPD and visual field showed temporal defect. Case 3 is a 22 years old lady. For the first time, she presented at 28 weeks of gestation with right-sided defective vision of 10 days duration. Presenting visual acuity was 1/60. Pupil showed grade 4 RAPD and visual field showed inferior altitudinal defect. She presented to us during the second episode at postpartum 3 months with left-sided defective vision of 7 days duration with best corrected visual acuity was 1/60 and the color vision, everything cannot be assessed and pupil showed grade 4 RAPD. These are the fundus photos of the first two cases showing disc edema. And this is a fundus photo of the second case, case 2 during the second episode, showing temporal pal in the right eye and left eye papillitis. All the patients were investigated, routine investigations were done, and everything was normal except for raised DSR. And the third case, aquaporin 4 and anti-Mo antibodies tested was negative. MRI of the brain and orbit showed optic nerve swelling in all the participants, and case 3 had additional findings, demyelinating findings in the brain, suggestive of multiple sclerosis. These are the MRI findings: axial fat suppressed T2 image showing thickened intraorbital segment of the optic nerve, suggestive of optic neuritis. These are the findings in the other MRI. So coming to the management, we treated all patients with intravenous medial prednisolone 1 gram OD for 3 days, followed by oral prednisolone 1 milligram per kg per day for 11 days as per ONTT protocol. We continued breastfeeding during the steroid treatment. We advised to postpone the nursing for 4 hours after corticosteroid treatment. Case number 3 was referred to the neurologist, and she was started on immunosuppressants. We followed up every 2 weeks for the first 1 month and monthly for next 2 months, and then thereafter 3 months. Coming to discussion, lactation-associated blindness, the differential diagnoses include mass lesions, infections, and autoimmune etiologies. Lactation optic neuritis is thought to be due to the reversal of type 1 and type 2 leukocytes and cytokine imbalances, sudden drop in estrogen and progesterone and glucocorticoid levels soon after delivery. Role of prolactin in immune system modulation was mentioned in multiple studies. In 25% of patients with multiple sclerosis, optic neuritis is the initial presenting symptoms. Hence, it is uncertain if lactation optic neuritis is truly idiopathic or a forerunner of multiple sclerosis. Erkile et al. Had reported on a case series of 4 lactating women who experienced optic neuritis as the first clinical manifestation of incipient multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis must be considered as an etiology for acute puerperal lactation-associated blindness when there is no clear anatomic or infectious cause. In multiple sclerosis, relapse rates during reduced relapse rates during pregnancy and increased relapse rates during the first 3 to 6 months postpartum is well recognized. Exacerbation of optic neuritis in pregnancy is rare, and only very few cases were reported in literature. However, in our third case, the patient presented with optic neuritis during pregnancy at 28 weeks. She developed CNS demyelination, which was suggestive of multiple sclerosis during the second episode at 3 months postpartum. Multiple studies have showed that breastfeeding is protective against postpartum relapses in multiple sclerosis. Exclusive breastfeeding should be encouraged in these people to prevent the risk of postpartum relapse. Lactation amenorrhea is found to increase interferon gamma production, reduce relapse rates. So lactation optic neuritis should be suspected when postpartum mothers present with acute loss of vision after delivery. Aggressive treatment with systemic steroids had positive outcomes. Continue breastfeeding to reduce chances of future relapses. Lactation optic neuritis may be the first manifestation of multiple sclerosis or NMSOD, so we have to follow up to initiate early treatment as needed. These are my references. Thank you. Hello, sir.
What was the duration of follow-up?
Hello, sir.
The final duration of follow-up all 3 patients.
Yes, sir. First 3 patients we were able to follow till 6 months, and the second and the recurrent case, she developed this. When we found that she developed the CNS demyelinating features, we referred her to neurologist, and she came for follow-up. We could follow up her only for 1 month, and then by that time her visual functions all has improved, and thereafter we lost her follow-up. But she's when we call up her on her phone, she is found to have normal, and she is now under neurologist treatment on immunosuppressants, but she didn't follow up here in our clinic.
That means when they first presented to you in lactation period, so the last MRI done was, that means when was the last follow-up?
Was in December 2019, sir.
That means after initiation of symptom, what was the last duration between the last follow-up?
It was we could follow up her only for 1 month. She came to our clinic for about 1 month. We could follow up her around 1 month post her symptoms have started.
Okay, you followed the patient after the symptoms started for 1 month. only.
1 month. For the last case, the second episode, sir. First episode, she was under follow-up only. But under follow-up, during pregnancy, she developed one episode, and then she improved after treatment, and she was under regular follow-up at her clinic. And then thereafter, she presented 3 months postpartum with other eye defective vision, and she consulted other local doctor there, and she was referred to our clinic after that, after taking the MRI. And we could follow up her after steroid treatment for 1 month.
In postpartum cases, you should also consider CVT.
Okay.
So an MRV could have also been done, because that is also an important cause. It is that incidence is reducing now, but
Okay.
that is another cause that you need to keep in mind.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, thank you.
Next presenter,
I
please.
think Dr. Parmita is there.
Yes.
Parmita, are you there?
Yes,
No.
ma'am. Hello. Yes, ma'am. Can you hear me? Hello. Ma'am, can you hear
Okay,
me?
you are there? Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, sir.
Should we call her? I think so. Dr. Parmita, you please present.
Dr.
Sorry, ma'am.
Parmita.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Ma'am, can I share my screen?
Yes, please.
Yeah, you should.
Good morning, judges. The topic of my presentation is a study of optic nerve involvement and retinal changes in acute encephalitic syndrome in the age group of 5 to 12 years. It is an observational study. Patients with encephalitis and meningoencephalitis have high risk of developing sequelae and complications of ocular structures that lead to focal neurological deficits and various oculovisual anomalies, including blindness in the future. Since northeastern part of India is endemic for AES, especially JE, so the present study was carried out to detect the posterior segment changes in acute stage of the disease and to identify the clinical and laboratory-based risk factors that will be helpful in reducing ocular morbidity in children. It was an observation study carried out in the Department of Pediatrics, Assam Medical College and Hospital, Dibrugarh. Duration of study was 6 months from July 2019 to December 2019. Sample size was 36 patients. The inclusion criteria was 36 diagnosed cases of AES in the age group of 5 to 12 years during the study period. And the exclusion criteria was patients with pre-existing ocular disorders and patients whose parents or guardians did not give consent or were not willing to participate in the study. Procedure: all patients underwent a thorough clinical evaluation of history, general and local examination within 14 days of presentation of symptoms. Detailed history was taken regarding the symptoms and ocular history about diminution of vision, double vision, deviation of eyes, limitation of eye movements, drooping of eyelids, face turn, chin elevation, etc. On examination, visual acuity was examined, visual field testing was done, external examination was done, and fundus examination was done by direct and indirect ophthalmoscopy. Investigations carried out were routine tests, serum CRP, and CSF analysis by lumbar puncture in the acute phase. Microbiological analysis of the CSF was done for culture and sensitivity of bacteria and virological test, that is IgM capture ELISA. Ethical approval was taken from Institutional Ethics Committee. Statistical analysis notes such scientific tools were needed. Coming to the results. First, the age distribution. Out of 36 cases, maximum number of cases were in the age group of 5 years, and the minimum number of cases were in the age group of 12 years, as we can see here. Coming to sex distribution, out of 36 patients, 63.8% were male and females were 36.1%. And coming to distribution of papilledema, out of 36 patients, 16 patients had papilledema and 20 patients had no papilledema. Coming to distribution of optic disc hyperemia, out of 36 patients, 19 had optic disc hyperemia and 17 had no hyperemia. Laterality of optic disc hyperemia, it was seen to be more in case of right eye, that is 19.4%, followed by left eye and then both eyes. Retinal hemorrhages were also found in 1%, that constituted 3% out of 36 cases. Coming to the discussion, age distribution. In our study, out of 36 cases, most commonly involved age group was 5 years, which was comparable to the other studies that we found in the literature. And sex distribution, out of 36 patients, 23 were males. More males predominated females in our study. That was relatable with the other studies, as I have mentioned. Coming to posterior segment changes, in our study, papilledema was more commonly found, followed by optic disc hyperemia, retinal hemorrhages. That was also comparable to the other studies. The limitations of my study was posterior segment signs were based on clinical examination only, therefore were subjective, and no objective examination could be carried out due to severely ill and unconscious condition of most patients. Follow-up was not included because of terminal nature of the disease in most of the cases. Conclusion, presence of posterior segment changes in AES can lead to morbid ocular sequelae and complications. Therefore, detecting them at an early age and adequate and timely intervention will help in preserving the eye functions. Funding was none, conflict of interest was none in my study, and ethical approval was taken from Ethics Committee, Assam Medical College and Hospital. Thank you. These are my references. Thank you.
But how did you make your PPT? Is it your the thing you have presented? No, is the text you have submitted to the AEOC, is it? And you have presented from the full text you had submitted, is it?
Yes, sir, because I did not get any mail regarding I have to prepare a PPT, sir. Sorry for that. Sorry for that, sir.
It will look a bit peculiar, that's why.
Yes, sir.
Actually, it will have your marks on your presentation. You should prepare PowerPoint, first of all. And why you have not put on your video?
Sir, my webcam is also not working. I'm trying to connect it from since morning, sir. I'm sorry for that also.
Okay, thank you.
I have a certain connection problem, sir.
Was there any hypertrophic pachymeningitis in your cases in MRI?
No, sir. Because MRI was not done in most of the cases because most of the children, they were bedridden and they were ill. They were in the ICU most of the cases. So MRI was not done in most of them. Only clinical examination was done and laboratory-based investigations.
Okay, if there are no further questions, I think
we can go to
the next speaker. Thank you, Dr. Bali.
Thank you.
Next speaker, call upon the next.
The next speaker is Karthik Kumar Mani. Karthik, are you there?
Yes, sir.
So you can start presenting, Karthik.
So, able to see my screen, sir?
Yes.
Please go full screen and then
Yes, make it full screen and go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. I'm presenting on a retrospective study on ethambutol-induced optic neuropathy. Ethambutol is a part of treatment protocol for tuberculosis since the 1960s. It causes a well-defined dose-related toxicity. Ethambutol chelates zinc, which is an important factor in nerve function, optic nerve function in particular. Visual loss is profound and sometimes permanent. So early diagnosis and timely replacement with alternate drug is important. So visual loss can be central or peripheral field loss with or without this chromatopsia. At a dose of under 15 milligram per kg per day, optic neuropathy is unlikely to develop, but at doses of 15 to 25 milligram per kg, visual symptoms may develop over a period of months. Some visual improvement may occur with discontinuation of the drug, though some visual field and contrast sensitivity abnormalities may persist. According to RNTCP, in old regimen, patients are receiving ethambutol for 2 months, that to 3 days a week. According to new guidelines, they are receiving daily ethambutol for a period of 6 months. The new guidelines are introduced in September 2017 and started following since 2018. Aim of our study was to evaluate visual decline in patients with ethambutol optic neuropathy and visual recovery after cessation of ethambutol, and to correlate changes in amplitude and latency of pattern VEP with visual loss and recovery. So we did a retrospective observational study of 30 consecutive patients presenting with ethambutol optic neuropathy at Aravind Eye Hospital, Coimbatore between July 19 and October 19. We included patients above 18 years of age and on ATT, including ethambutol at a dose of 15 to 25 milligram per kg. And we excluded patients of any known pathology of optic nerve. Visual acuity, color vision, contrast sensitivity, central fields by Jerome screen, anterior segment and fundus examination were done in all visits. VEP was recorded at the time of presentation. Once ethambutol optic neuropathy was diagnosed, after discussing with the treating physician, ethambutol was stopped and replaced with levofloxacin. In results, we had 18 men and 12 women with a mean age of 54 years. And the average interval from onset of vision loss to stopping ethambutol was 4.4 weeks. Mean visual acuity of all patients at presentation was 6/24, and they had a vision of 6/12 at 3 months follow-up. Duration of visual decline to stopping of ethambutol and its impact on visual recovery. Patients who stopped ethambutol 4 or more weeks after visual decline presented with a vision of 636 and they improved to 615 at 3 months follow-up. And those who stopped ethambutol less than 4 weeks presented with a vision of 618 and improved to 69 in follow-up. The presenting vision of patients who stopped more than 4 weeks was statistically significantly worse than patients who stopped before 4 weeks. At follow-up, although the visual acuity was still worse in more than 4-week group compared to less than 4-week group, this did not reach statistical significance. VEP amplitude was 1.4 microvolt for patients who stopped ethambutol more than 4 weeks after visual decline, while it was 2.4 microvolt in patients who stopped less than 4 weeks after visual decline, which was statistically significant, and it was also consistent with the visual acuity differences between these two groups. The latencies were normal and without statistically significant difference between these two groups. Normal VEP in this population is 5 microvolt. So in all cases, it was reduced compared to normal. It was also observed that patients who presented with normal or hyperemic optic disc had good visual recovery than those who presented with temporal pallor or pale disc, correlating with less than 4 weeks and more than 4 weeks group. Toxicity from ethambutol is dose related, and current regimen recommend a dose of 15 to 25 milligram per kg per day. Patients who took longer to stop ethambutol presented with worse vision than patients who stopped it sooner. These findings support prompt cessation of ethambutol after presumed optic neuropathy to prevent visual decline. These findings are consistent with other reports of visual decline in ethambutol toxicity. Kumar et al. Found poor presenting vision of between 20/120 and counting fingers with a mean interval between onset of therapy and toxic effects of 3.4 months. An important finding of our study was that the worse the vision was at presentation, the worse was the final outcome. All patients had reduced VEP amplitudes in our study. Unfortunately, we do not have VEP results after visual improvement to demonstrate changes after cessation of ethambutol. There were no significant changes in latency from the normal population in any group which is consistent with the non-demyelinating optic neuropathy. To conclude, the interval from vision loss to stopping ethambutol is an important marker for visual recovery. VEP amplitudes were consistently reduced in our series of patients, but there was no change in latency. Limitations of our study include small sample size, retrospective nature, and lack of VEP results after visual improvement. Future studies could include correlation with OCT and visual field analysis. There is a recent increase in ethambutol optic neuropathy after change in regimen. So regular ophthalmic evaluation for patients on ATT is mandatory, and treating physicians should be sensitized about ethambutol optic neuropathy and need for eye examinations. Awareness should be created among patients to watch for blurred vision while on ATT. These were my references. Thank you.
Doctor, hello?
Sir,
how many cases presented with papillitis and how many cases presented with retrobulbar neuritis?
Sir, all 30 patients, sir, we didn't note any disc edema, sir. All of them are
Retrobulbar.
presenting with either normal disc or with a temporal pallor and pale disc, sir.
So with the APD only you diagnosed as optic neuritis.
Sir, sorry, sir.
Afferent pupillary defect only you diagnosed as retrobulbar neuritis and visual acuity only.
Visual acuity, sir.
And any APD? Afferent pupillary defect?
Yes, sir. Sir, but usually the patients, the optic neuropathy was symmetrical, sir, but we couldn't, we didn't get any RAPD kind of pictures, sir. It was like sluggish pupil in both the eyes.
Okay.
Karthik,
yes, sir.
That, why you have not seen color vision in those cases?
Sir, sorry, sir.
Color vision testing.
Yes, sir. Color vision was defective, sir.
Okay, that's a basic tool for a
diagnosing.
What tool did you use to check color vision?
Ma'am, Ishihara chart, ma'am.
But what was the range of visual acuity in your patient? You use Ishihara for everybody, whatever is the level of color, their visual acuity.
No, ma'am. Patients with very poor vision, they were not able to read it, ma'am.
Ishihara is not truly the ideal test. At what level of visual acuity, up to what level can you use Ishihara pseudo-isochromatic?
Ma'am, probably 636, ma'am.
Yeah, no, 618. Usually
618.
up to 618. That is what is recommended. If you actually read the Ishihara instructions, 618.
Okay, ma'am.
So you may need to use other modes of methods. And ideally for a study, you should use other methods, ideally.
Okay,
But
ma'am.
then there are limitations.
Okay, ma'am.
It's an important study. Yeah, it's an important study.
Thank you, ma'am.
You did the VEP after improvement of
Sir, sorry, sir.
You did the VEP after improvement of vision or after suggestion of Hambitol?
Sir, during the first visit, sir, when they presented with ethambutol optic neuropathy, during the first visit, we did VEP, sir.
But in your conclusion, you have written that the VEP was consistently reduced in amplitude.
Sir, that was consistently in all patients, sir. We didn't have follow-up VEP, sir. When vision was improved, we didn't do VEP. Future studies we have to do, sir.
I have 3 questions, doctor.
Yes, sir.
First is, why you use Jerome screen?
So since most of the patients had poor vision, sir, we did Jerome screen, sir, and also like in our regular OPD, we do central fields with Jerome screen, and then the follow-up visits we do HFA, sir. If the vision is good, when they can do it.
Okay. Next question is, your mean age of your study population was around 54.
Yes, sir.
Was there any ocular comorbidity? Because they are presumably all are tuberculosis patients.
Yes, sir.
Cataract was there, or any other ocular comorbidity was there or not? You have not mentioned.
Sir, those patients we excluded, sir. Yes, sir. Other causes of visual deficiency we excluded, sir.
How many of the TB patients, what
yes, sir.
percentage of TB patients receive ethambutol in India? Any idea? 100%? All tuberculosis patient first line?
Yes, sir. All patients are receiving ethambutol, sir, according to new guidelines.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
The next speaker again, I think, Karthik, you are presenting one more paper, sir.
Yes, sir.
So I think you can start your next presentation.
Yes, sir.
hide point.
Sir, able to see my screen, sir?
Yeah,
Yes.
Yes. I am presenting an acquired oculomotor palsy, a retrospective study in a tertiary eye care center. Acquired oculomotor palsies can be divided into third, fourth, sixth, and multiple cranial nerve palsies. Vasculopathic risk factors are the most common cause of isolated nerve palsy. Other causes include trauma, inflammation, infection, and neoplasm. Since it can be a presenting feature of more serious condition like tumor, it becomes essential to know the etiological profile of current cranial nerve palsies to plan for appropriate management. Some causes can be vision and life-threatening, which needs timely intervention. We aim to study the incidence, clinical profile, and etiology of the patients presenting with acquired oculomotor palsies. We did a retrospective observational study, including 391 patients presenting with oculomotor palsies at Arvind Eye Hospital, Coimbatore, between September 19 and February 20 over a period of 6 months. All patients were more than 18 years of age. Data were collected from hospital record. A detailed history, refraction, intraocular pressure, color vision, central fields, anterior segment and fundus examination, blood investigations, diplopia, Hess charting, and systemic evaluation were done in all patients. Neuroimaging was done in all multiple cranial nerve palsies and whenever needed in isolated nerve palsy. We had a total of 391 patients and incidence of nerve palsies in neuro-ophthalmology clinic was 12.9%. 11.3% of patients lost to follow, probably due to lockdown. We had 56% of patients presenting with sixth nerve palsy, followed by 23% third nerve palsy, 15% fourth nerve palsy, and 6% of the patients with multiple cranial nerve palsies. Average age of presentation was 54.4 years. Males were more commonly affected than females. Sixth nerve palsy was significantly greater, and 53.5% of patients received neuroimaging either through an MRI or CT. These were the causes we found in our study, and the 5 common causes were ischemia at 69.5%, followed by trauma, ischemia, idiopathic, and compressive causes. The proportion in each cranial nerve. In isolated cranial nerves, nerve palsies 3, 4, and 6, ischemic cause was found to be more prevalent, followed by traumatic cause and inflammatory cause. In multiple cranial nerve palsy, traumatic and inflammatory cause was more prevalent, followed by compressive causes. Compressive causes were also found in third and sixth nerve palsies. Out of 391 patients, 210 patients had diabetes, 132 patients had hypertension, and 38 patients had hypercholesterolemia. And diabetes was the most common systemic history found across all nerve palsies, and double vision was the most common presenting symptom across all nerve palsies. And cranial nerve palsies had a prevalence increased in older patients, 55 to 64 years age group across cranial nerve 3, 4, and 6. Trauma is the most prevalent etiology between ages 20 to 39, while ischemia is the most common among ages 40 and above. So cranial nerve palsy refers to disorders that lead to partial or complete loss of cranial nerve functionality. Ischemic causes were the most frequent at 69.5%. Similar prevalence was seen in Fulgile et al. Study done at AIIMS. When patients had multiple cranial nerve involvement, traumatic and inflammatory causes were frequent. Head trauma was reported to be associated with more multiple cranial nerve injuries rather than isolated single nerve palsy. Western studies find trauma to be fourth most common cause, whereas our study finds trauma to be the second most common cause. In India, road traffic and two-wheeler accidents are more prevalent, possibly leading to increased traumatic etiology. Neuroimaging rates were lower at 53.5%, but greater neuroimaging rate was seen in the West. According to one study, 36% had prospective MRIs and 65% already had neuroimaging done before consultation. In our study, diabetes had a higher association with cranial nerve palsies, while Western studies find hypertension to be more prevalent. Similar trend like our study was seen in Fulgile et al. Study. Diplopia was the most common presenting complaint, followed by drooping, defective vision, and pain. Similar association was made by other studies. Sixth nerve was the most common, and similar prevalence was seen in Fulgile et al. Study and Bradley Richards et al. Study. Isolated cranial nerve palsies were more prevalent in older patients. Multiple cranial nerve palsies were more prevalent in 50 to 54 year age group, probably with higher association with traumatic etiologies. Men were more affected than females at a ratio of 2.69:1. Higher associations of cranial nerve palsies were those of trauma, diabetes, and hypertension, which are all reported to be male predominant. Between ages 20 to 39, trauma is the most common etiology, but this changes to ischemia between ages 40 and above. So traumatic brain injuries tend to be more prevalent in younger population, with males between 18 to 44 years being affected the most. Out of 13 patients with compressive lesions, we had 11 patients with space-occupying lesions and 2 had carotid cavernous fistula. The space-occupying lesions we found in our study were schwannoma, meningioma, hemangioma, pituitary adenoma, skull metastasis, and sinonasal malignancy. We had 2 patients with mucormycosis presenting with multiple cranial nerve palsy. To conclude, the most common cranial nerve palsy was 6-nerve palsy. Males were more affected than females. The most common etiology was ischemia, followed by trauma, inflammation, and neoplasm. Trauma being more prevalent at younger age and ischemia at older age. Understanding different types of cranial nerve palsies will help in building a better comprehension, which will aid in timely diagnosis and prompt treatment. Now there is a change in trend post-COVID with increase in infective cause and decrease in traumatic cause due to lockdown. These are my references. Thank you.
Hello?
Yes, sir.
Apart from the discussion, what is the main treatment you have given to the ischemic pathology, etiology? Ischemic, for ischemic case.
Sir, for
apart
ischemic,
from treatment for diabetes, hypertension,
yes,
what
sir.
yeah.
Sir, for patients with ischemic etiology, we asked them to control the systemic
Yeah, of course.
parameters, sir. And then we were closely following up the patients, sir. Mostly they were recovering within a month, sir.
Like any cases, did you try with aspirin or methylcobalamin, like that?
Yes, sir. All patients were given methylcobalamin, sir. Like multivitamins, neurovitamins we have given, sir. But aspirin we have not given, sir.
Oh, okay, okay. Any other panelists, madam, sir?
What are the duration of follow-up, Dr. Karthik?
Minimum they had a 3 months follow-up, ma'am.
But how did anyone require surgical intervention? Was there any residual double vision which needed any intervention? Or all recovered? It's because it's a very large number. That's the good thing about the study. Its numbers were really impressive. So what was the outcomes? That could have come out a little better, I feel.
Yeah, ma'am. Ma'am, ischemic causes, like they all improved well, ma'am. And like traumatic causes, ma'am, like they didn't improve well, ma'am.
So you need to follow up those patients,
Yes.
and share that. It's I think very large numbers. Good study.
शेयर स्क्रीन करना होगा तो इससे कर देना होगा करेंगे आपका बैकग्राउंड
Judges, this is Dr. Partha calling.
इसको मिनिमम करें
Judges, this is Dr. Partha. Session has to be in time. So please just check that if we can just finish in time.
इसको ओपन कर दो
Thank you.
कर देगा स्लाइड शेयर
Thank you very much. Dr. Sunita, yeah. I would request you to make sure that we end in time. 9:25. Thank you very much.
I think we have a last speaker. We call the last speaker.
Thank you.
Dr. Abhishek is there.
I cannot find Dr. Abhishek on the screen, but I can see
Madam,
Dr.
Madam, Mr. Jai Gopal has come. Previous speaker. Jai Gopal Agarwal is on.
Please
Yes,
present.
I want to present my paper.
Please present.
Okay. Just a minute, just a minute. Good morning to everybody. Can you see the my
Yes,
screen?
yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Yes. My presentation. Good morning to everybody. Thank you, respected judges. My presentation is the time is vision as the earliest high dose of IV methylprednisolone in course and mild optic neuritis predicts the visual recovery and outcome. My study is totally self-financed and not supported by any research grant. The objective is that according to the North American optic neuritis treatment trial group, acute treatment of optic neuritis in multiple sclerosis by IV methylprednisolone accelerates recovery, but does not affect the final visual outcome, leads to sense of non-urgency in the treatment of acute phase of optic neuritis. But the clinical course of optic neuritis in neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorder with aquaporin 4 and MOG positive patient differs from the multiple sclerosis that they are totally steroid dependent and they are steroid responsive. It is associated with the poor visual outcome and recurrences. Poor recovery from each attack increases the cumulative disability. In this study of the optic neuritis, we will try to find out the role of high dose of IV methylprednisolone, whether the earliest treatment results in the best corrected visual acuity recovery at 3 months. Earliest treatment means here that the minimum time for the onset of symptoms to the high dose IV methylprednisolone, that is time to IV methylprednisolone. We go for the diagnosis of optic neuritis based on the clinical history, objective finding determined by the clinical examination of neuro-ophthalmologist and paraclinical test. These are some inclusion and exclusion criteria shown in the slides. All diagnosed cases of optic neuritis cases have to have the diagnosis of neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorder with aquaporin 4 and MOG based on the international consensus of diagnostic criteria of NMOSD 2015. For aquaporin hemoglobin and MOG hemoglobin test, we have considered any optic neuritis unless classical multiple sclerosis or any atypical optic neuritis with severe vision loss. Aquaporin hemoglobin and MOG hemoglobin antibodies are tested using the commercial cell-based assay. On the basis of above methodology, a retrospective study was performed. The total number of cases is 32, out of which 25 are aquaporin 4 positive and 7 are the MOG positive. All records are taken from the neuro-ophthalmology and neurology department between the year 2016 and 2020. This study is totally focused on the visual acuity as a functional outcome, not with other functional parameters such as visual field or OCT measurements are taken into account. Documentation is done for the age of the patient, sex, antibody groups, time to start the IV methylprednisolone in days, best corrected visual acuity at the time of presentation, and 1 month and 3 months. This is a data sheet of my study. The overall mean age of presentation in this study is 41, in which the 75% are female. For aquaporin 4 patients, the 84 patients are female. For patient with MOG positive, there is no age or sex bar, even the children can be affected. Now, if you analyze the best corrected visual acuity trend, best corrected visual acuity at the start reveals no trend towards the worst best visual corrected prognosis when the cutoff time date is 4 days or 7 days. If you analyze the distribution of best corrected visual acuity at 1 month, this box plot shows that the patient treated within 7 days is better than the patient treated after the 7 days. And if you analyze the best corrected visual at 3 months, here again, the patient treated with less than 7 days is better than the patient after the 7 days. If we analyze the failure to regain the 0 log mark, that is 6/6 as a variable, and considering the cutoff time to IV methylprednisolone, age of the patient, and best corrected visual acuity at start as a breakdown, here I take the help of ROC curve, and after analysis, it is shown the effect of cutoff time to IV methylprednisolone. Here the area under the curve is 0.81, and Youdon's index shows that it is the 4 days, and the patient who treated after the 4 days is odds ratio is 7.82. Thus, the effect of cutoff time to IV methylprednisolone as 4 days is significant, but the effect of age and best corrected visual acuity as it starts is a minimal effect either individually or in combination. If we same is the analysis after the failure of regain the 0.2 log mark vision, that is 6/9. Here again, of effective cutoff time is 7 days, and that is significant, but it is less. But it is less if the cutoff time is 4 days. There is no effect of age and best corrected visual acuity start. To conclude, without waiting the aquaporin 4 and MOG positive result, the earliest hyperacute treatment within 4 days with IV methylprednisolone increases the good visual recovery. This is just contrary to non-adjunctive treatment in the acute phase of optic neuritis in the multiple sclerosis. So even the 7 days in the delay is detrimental. So change in the treatment paradigm is to need the earliest hyperacute treatment of methylprednisolone in all forms of acute antibody-mediated optic neuritis. Time is tissue is a core principle of this field in neuro-ophthalmology. Here is the same analogy. Here the time is vision in the patient with optic neuritis. Here is some drawback that it should be prospective. It's a large coherent patient is treated, and additional parameters should be used, and with the subsequent attacks should be added. And these are my references. Thank you. Thank you to all.
Dr. Kumudini, do we have questions for Dr. Jay Gopal?
Not sitting. Oh, video in my gallery view.
Show my video in gallery view. If there are no questions, can we, the last speaker is still there, sir. Can we continue? The last speaker is just show my video in gallery.
नहीं ऐसा कुछ नहीं और कहीं कुछ नहीं दिया
चैट में क्या है चैट में
चैट में
अभिषेक कुमार
नो उसमें भी प्रैक्टिकल चैट कर देगा
So thank you, sir, Dr. Jay Gopal Agarwal.
Okay, thank you all of you.
Dr. Abhishek, you can share your screen and we can start your paper.
Dr. Abhishek, your voice is not coming. You are not audible, Dr. Abhishek.
Can you hear me, sir, now?
Now it's okay. Now it's okay. Make it a full screen and go ahead.
Please start, Dr. Abhishek.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, I'm not able to open the screen.
Can you at least move the screen? We can just we can go ahead with this.
Yes, ma'am.
Because we are already behind time.
Just 1 sec, ma'am. 1 sec.
Hand over the hall to some other specialty. You show us the last slide, please.
Madam, actually we are running and we end the schedule. Others speakers
I think
and
we can start now.
Dr. Abhishek.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Can you start your?
Sir, are you able to see my screen completely?
We can see, Doctor. Continue.
Make it full screen.
Show the last slide.
Good morning,
slide.
judges. Last slide.
My goodness. Show us the conclusion slide.
Conclusion. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Should I start from here?
Finish it fast within 1 minute.
Okay. The topic of my study is neuro-ophthalmic manifestation in people with HIV and AIDS. So we've concluded that the spectrum of neuro-ophthalmic manifestations is broad and it's very commonly seen in HIV patients. Many of these patients are usually asymptomatic and may take years to manifest. And the most commonly observed neuro-ophthalmic lesions that is found in our study was found to be in the optic nerve. And we also concluded that the ART therapy, that is antiretroviral therapy, has changed the face of HIV-related eye disease with a serious reduction in ocular opportunistic infection and ocular malignancies. We've also concluded that the low CD4 T cell counts and advanced stage of HIV disease are among the predictors of ocular involvement, and hence the treating physician must be aware of these complications which are likely to arise anytime with the course of the disease. These are my references. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhishek.
Thanks, Dr. Abhishek.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Okay. Should I switch off the video, ma'am?
Thank you to all judges.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, madam. Thank you so
all
much.
this, and now
Thank you,
we
everyone.
close our session.
Thank you. Thank you.